I tried to move the sheet off my body, and I couldn't move it off my body. My arm was too weak to lift it up. Fear creates disease. Addressing the childhood traumas is how I got out of remission and fully healed.
Hello, everyone. I have a very special guest with me today. Her name is Dr. Sina McCullough. I'm going to let her introduce herself, tell us a little bit about her story. But when I heard her, I had gone to the Farm in Your Own Backyard with a friend of mine back in October, got the privilege of hearing Dr. Sina for the first time. And this one particular subject, we're actually talking about childhood trauma, just hit home so much. I just know that there's so many people that can identify. Light bulbs will go on with this subject. We'll get into that in just a minute. But first, I want to introduce you to Dr. Sina McCullough, and I want to thank you so much for taking this time to break this down for us in a minute. But first, if you'll introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about you and kind of your story.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's my privilege to be here with you today. So I actually have a PhD in nutritional science from the University of California, Davis. I'm the creator of an online program called Go Wild: How I Reverse Chronic and Autoimmune Disease. That's where I teach you step by step the roadmap to reversing all of these quote unquote diseases. I've written two books, international bestsellers. One's Hands Off My Food. And my second book I co-wrote with Joel Salatin from Polyface Farm, and that one's titled Beyond Labels. The book was so well received that we turned it into a podcast. So now Joel and I co-host a weekly podcast called Beyond Labels, named after the book. And in that, we basically tell you the latest breaking news in food and health space, and we try to arm you with solutions, right? So all of my work is really solutions-based oriented. I try to educate, empower, and encourage people. And we do that through knowledge and through easy, practical steps that people can take in their daily lives in order to reclaim their health, their freedom, and their vitality. In addition, I'm a consultant. I'm also an expert health writer for the Epoch Times. I started a new cooking series called Intuitive Cooking with Dr. Sina, where I teach you how to stop outsourcing your power to other people like me, right? The supposed experts, and instead really tap into your own intuition to figure out what your body needs and what it doesn't want. My greatest joy, though, comes from my children. I have three children that I homeschool, and they are my daily reminder of what is important to me. It's really cherishing being in the moment with the ones that I love and growing, deepening those relationships. I got here because I almost died actually from an autoimmune disease myself. It was over 8 years ago now, but through the grace of God, I was able to fully heal myself. I have no markers or signs of disease or any type of inflammation in my body. I'm fully healed. I'm not in remission, fully healed. And I did that by God showing me a different path that was pretty much outside of anything I had learned previously. And so now I spend my time dedicated to helping other people find their second chance too.
Bringing this back around to the topic that I really wanted to hit today, you had talked about there's a link, there can be a link between childhood trauma and future health issues. So
Exactly.
I'm not going to try to get into that because you're going to do such a better job. So I'm just going to turn that over to you to kind of share that with the audience on what we're actually talking about.
My journey is very similar to a lot of other people's health stories. Okay. I ended up developing an advanced stage of rheumatoid arthritis in my 30s. It was so debilitating that it was hard for me to even wrap my hand around a cup because my hand was in so much pain. I couldn't walk up the stairs without getting winded. If I sat up in my seat, it felt like my ribs would just collapse. Like I couldn't even hold myself up. My teeth hurt when I was chewing food. It felt like they were going to fall out. And basically, I spent my days lying on the floor in pain. I was just too weak to get up. So this obviously didn't happen overnight. This developed at least over 20 years. And, if you go back into the womb, which is an area we're going to come back to in a moment, the etiology of the imbalances that I experienced started actually in the womb. But my most notable symptoms started in my early 20s. Okay. It started with gastrointestinal issues. So within 20 minutes of eating, I would become so distended that it looked like I was 5 months pregnant. It was also accompanied by like cramping and what they would call nowadays irritable bowel syndrome or IBS, right? So I'd have cramping and then I'd have diarrhea and then constipation, and the cycle would repeat. And there seemed to be no rhyme or reason. One day I could eat pizza from my favorite, pizza joint, and I was fine. The next week I'd go to the same pizza place, order the same pizza, and I was buckled over in pain. So it was really difficult to figure out. And I was in college at this time, and I did go and see a Western medicine doctor, diagnosed me with IBS, and prescribed Tagamet, right? That's another prescription drug they wanted me to consume every single time before I was going to eat food. And I was around 20 years old. And I thought, even at that age, I thought to myself, I am not going to be dependent on a prescription drug for the rest of my life just so I can eat a piece of food. Like, this is ridiculous. There has to be some underlying cause. Well, I kept asking and asking, and no doctor had an answer. I mean, eventually, I saw so many specialists and I had so many procedures done that I ended up losing count. I had at least 3 colonoscopies, 2 sigmoidoscopies, breath tests, urine tests, fecal tests, blood tests. And at one point, I even had exploratory surgery. And none of the specialists had any answers. However, over time, as I'm getting all these tests done, my symptoms got worse. I started to have like delayed recovery from colds. So it might take my family 3 or 5 days to recover. It would take me over 2 weeks to recover. I had nausea, brain fog almost constantly. Like, I remember trying to read a kid's book to my child, and I couldn't even understand what I was reading in the book. Like, because some days the brain fog was so bad. I had chronic sinus infections. I had a kidney stone that developed. And of course, at the time, they told me it was from eating meat. Well, at that time, actually, I was vegan. So, that doesn't make sense, right? I also ended up having a tumor that developed on the sclera, or the white of my eye. And the eye specialists who I saw said they didn't know why the tumor was forming, but they could guarantee me it would continue to grow over my cornea and would eventually blind me. So that was very helpful. I also ended up having 5 miscarriages, and I sought help from Western doctors the entire time. I mean, in and out of office. It's like I lived at the doctor's office with medical bills mounting, right? I mean, you know the story. And nobody knew what was wrong. They couldn't figure it out. And eventually, the doctors started to not believe me. The last specialist I saw told me that the symptoms had to be in my head because none of these doctors I saw could figure it out. So that's when I knew that if I had any chance of healing, I was on my own, right? I was going to have to figure this out by myself. So I actually convinced my husband to be my co-detective. And he was a great co-detective because he has a PhD in chemical engineering. So he helped me scour the scientific literature, and we stumbled upon something called leaky gut, right? Or increased intestinal permeability. And back then, this wasn't mainstream like it is now. You didn't hear people talking about leaky gut all the time. So he found it actually in the literature, and we theorized that there were different triggers causing leaky gut. And these were physical triggers. Okay. So I was still looking for the answer on the physical level. So some of the triggers that we theorized were gluten and chemicals like pesticides and GMOs. So I changed my diet to all organic foods, and I went gluten-free, or what I thought was gluten-free at the time, right? Now we can talk about that too. That's a labeling misnomer. So I was doing all these things, and I was cooking everything from scratch. I tried all different types of gut healing protocols like the GAPS diet, Candida, paleo, keto, AIP. Nothing worked. I would start to get better for a few days, and then I would get worse. And as I was getting worse, the list of foods I could eat were dwindling down. Eventually, I could only eat about from a half a sheet of paper. And foods that we think of as healthy, like apples and bananas, were actually making me sick as well. And at this point, like I said, everything was from scratch. I never went out to eat. Everything was organic, but I still developed a new symptom, and that was low grade muscle pain. And it was accompanied by extreme fatigue. And I had been a competitive athlete for most of my life at the time. So I was familiar with pain. This pain migrated throughout my body with seemingly no rhyme or reason. And because they couldn't identify it or isolate it, they all just dismissed it. All the doctors dismissed it. This is when I actually hit my tipping point. My entire family got the flu and they recovered within about 2 days. I actually ended up having to go to the ER because I passed out and I just spiraled downhill from there. That's when I got to the point where my teeth were hurting when I chewed and I couldn't wrap my hand around a cup. I started to experience muscle wasting like a cancer patient would experience. I lost 15 pounds in 1 month, even though I was eating constantly. I mean, I would put real salt on top of avocados and just scoop it, into my mouth throughout the day. And I couldn't stop the weight loss. And that was the first time in about 20 years of trying to find the answer that I was actually really scared, right? Because that's when I couldn't control what was happening to me. And so that's the point when I actually surrendered to God. And I remember it really vividly because every morning, my husband was going to work, and every morning he would pick me up from the bed and he'd carry me down the stairs and he'd put me on the couch. Whew. It just floods back sometimes, and I had 2 children at the time, 2 young boys. And my husband would basically turn the TV on for them, and he would put food and water on the coffee table so that they could get food. And my older son was about 5 at the time. And I remember because he would bring a cup to me with a straw and he would hold it to my mouth so that I could drink during the day. And that's what I did. I had my laptop on all day listening to free online health summits, like 40 to 60 hours a week of listening to these health summits, trying to piece it all together to find the answers to save my own life. So the one day when I was waiting for my husband to come pick me up and bring me down the stairs and put me on the couch, I tried to move the sheet off my body and I couldn't move it off my body. My arm was too weak to lift it up. And that's when I remember I just started crying and I just surrendered. And I just told him, I've tried everything I know. I've used all my resources. Utilized all these doctors' expertise. I researched myself. My husband's helped me. I can't figure it out on my own. I need your help. If you would please save my life so that my kids won't grow up without a mother, then I'll spend the rest of my life helping the rest of your children find their second chance. And like that same day, he showed me the answer. He showed me a totally different path. And that path is what led to complete healing. And like I said, today, I am completely healthy. I have more energy than I did in my 20s. And even 3 years ago, so I'm 48 right now. 3 years ago, at the age of 45, I gave birth to my third child, a little baby girl. She was the healthiest of all my kids. She was almost 9 pounds, right? Born naturally at home. And she has had no health problems since then. And that was at age 45,
Wow.
right? So it's amazing what your body can actually do if you don't buy into all these limiting beliefs that society has kind of imposed upon us.
Yes.
But so now I'm totally healed. But what happened was I got to a point where you would say I was in remission, right? Where I was up moving around and I could function during the day. But if I stress too much, for instance, or let's say I ate too much sugar, like even if it was fruit sugar, then I would have pain come back in my right forearm. Right. So that would be an example of someone who's in remission. So you're not fully healed because I had a flare up, is what you would call that in the autoimmune community. Right. So here's the thing. in the autoimmune community, amongst the patients themselves and amongst the doctors who treat people who have autoimmune conditions, being in remission is thought of as a good thing, right? You rejoice when you're in remission. And that's pretty much what most medical doctors will say as far as they can do to help you is to try to get you into remission, if that's even possible, right? So I got into the point of remission and I decided that I didn't want to live in that state of fear anymore. Because when you live in remission, you are constantly in fear that that disease is going to come back. That if you stress too much, if you eat the wrong thing, right, it's going to come back. And so to me, living in that space of fear was pretty much as bad as having the disease itself, because as we'll talk about in a few minutes, fear creates disease. So I thought, I'm not really in a healthy state right now because I'm walking around constantly afraid. And if you do that, the disease will come back. And sure enough, you see this time and time again. When patients get into remission, you'll see this for cancer patients, right? We've all heard this. They'll get into remission, and then several years later, they'll be like, oh, the cancer is back. Well, it actually never was gone, right? And if you look at the definition of remission, even when the Cancer Institute says the cancer may still be present in the body, right? Even though they call it remission. If you look in a dictionary, remission is defined often as like a temporary abatement, right? Like a temporary relief from, but it's not a healing. So what I did was I said, I'm not going to buy into that limiting belief. And so I'm just going to believe that remission doesn't even exist and that I'm just not fully healed yet, meaning I haven't found all the triggers that I need to find in order to fully reverse this disease or imbalance that I have. Because the way that I look at disease is it's like an onion that has many different layers to it. And you need to find all those layers. In other words, find all those various triggers, your individual triggers, and remove them in order to allow the body to heal. Well, the outer layers of the onion are the physical triggers. Okay. And this is like the roadmap that we're talking about now. Okay. The outer layers are these physical triggers. So things like food triggers. Everybody has food triggers, right? They're all unique. There are some food triggers that are the most common across the board of all chronic and autoimmune conditions. And those top food triggers are going to be grains. So all grains, not just gluten. You can't just go gluten-free. It's grain-free. So all grains. So we have grains, we have dairy and sugar. So those are the top three triggers, food triggers. But of course, each person has their own individual beyond those three. So there's food triggers in this outer layers of the onion. There's things like chemicals in the environment. So like glyphosate, for instance, GMOs, there's heavy metals that are often play a role. Things like mycotoxins, right? Exposure to different mold, which is much more rampant than we ever thought it was. So there's all these different layers to go through. There's man-made EMFs, so exposure to things like Wi-Fi, cell towers, your cell phone, high tension power lines, right? That's another physical trigger. Things in the water, for instance, so you have to make sure that you're really filtering your water and getting clean water. There's not only like heavy metals in the water that have been detected, and glyphosate, of course, because like glyphosate is water soluble, but other things like pharmaceutical drugs have been found in city water. So you do want to make sure that you are aware of what's in your water and you have the appropriate filtration system. So there's things like that. Those are all on the physical level. So you can, in my experience, for myself, working with my family and clients and reading case studies, you can address these physical triggers and get into remission. Okay. But then how do you get out of remission and into a space where you're fully healed? This is where you go into the mental, emotional, spiritual level of healing. Okay. So, and I want to start off by saying, because sometimes this can be a huge jump for people to get from the physical level to this emotional, mental level. But I'll tell you, Western medicine is already there because the CDC itself has actually said that between 90 to 95% of all chronic diseases are either caused by or related to stress. Okay, so Western medicine is clumping this category as stress. Okay, it's the same thing when I'm talking about being imbalanced emotionally or mentally or spiritually. That's another way of saying the word stress. So sometimes people need to think of this root cause level as it is just stress, and that's okay too, right? And they're obviously connected. When you're stressed out, you have elicited emotions, right? And so you are not peaceful, you're not calm, you're not centered, right? You're not exuding joy and gratitude. So you are in this emotional imbalance, which is what in Western medicine we call stress. So we're actually talking about the same thing. So you can just picture the inside ball of that onion as a ball of stress, right? And you're trying to actually peel that away. So now let's go into what you were talking about with how does this in the world relate to childhood trauma? Okay. So, and by the way, this is addressing the childhood traumas is how I got out of remission and fully healed. Okay. So most of us are actually in a chronic state of fight or flight, even if we don't realize it. Now, just to catch everybody up in case they're unaware, when you encounter usually like a physical stress, the body will respond by releasing stress hormones and it'll put you into fight or flight or freeze. All right. And the familiar example we use is you're walking down the street and a tiger jumps out, right, from behind a building, let's say, and your body goes into that state of fight or flight, which means you've activated your sympathetic nervous system. And that nervous system has released adrenaline and cortisol and other chemicals that are designed to help you get out of that stressful situation. So they're designed to help you, for instance, fight that tiger or run away from it. This is actually a really fantastic tool to have, right? When God created us, this was a beautiful design because in this type of that type of acute situation with like a lion coming after you, it can actually save your life. Okay. It actually also builds resiliency into your body, right? As long as you can complete the stress response cycle. So it means you get activated into the sympathetic nervous system state when the tiger jumps out, and then you either run or you fight the tiger. And when that stress is gone, you come out of the sympathetic nervous system state back into the parasympathetic nervous system. That's where we have rest, digestion, and repair, right? This is the state you need to be in, the parasympathetic nervous system state. You need to be in that state in order to heal the body, because that's when the body does the repair. Okay. If you can complete that response cycle from sympathetic back down to parasympathetic, that will build resiliency in your nervous system. Okay. When you can't complete that cycle is when we have problems. Okay. So now we're going to go into that's the connection between the childhood trauma and the disease is not being able to complete this stress response cycle. Okay. So just keep that in mind. So back when we think of these fight or flight mechanism, we tend to think of the hunters and gatherers, right? And they were chased by like literal animals, right, for food. So, but the interesting thing is, we actually don't think they were in fight or flight most of the time. That's actually a modern issue. We think that on average, we spend about 70% of our day in fight or flight, right? That's on average. Where our ancient ancestors, we're estimating they spent maybe 30% of their day in fight or flight. So we are severely flipped in this equation. We're in the sympathetic state way too much. Now, we might not actually think that we're in a chronic state of fight or flight because we don't see these tigers jumping out from the buildings, right? But you don't actually have to be chased by some kind of physical trigger, some physical stress to get into fight or flight. Mental and emotional stress is viewed by your body as tigers chasing you. And we call these emotional tigers. So when you're running from an emotional tiger, a common defense mechanism is going to be like you're going to keep yourself busy. So maybe you stay busy with working on a project, right? You have your to-do list and you got to go, go, go. Or maybe you spend busy with your mind by dwelling on events that happened in the past. Or maybe you worry about things that might happen in the future. Or you've created a schedule that's so jam-packed full of activities that it's overwhelming, right? Or you're on your phone on social media, right, as a distraction from these emotional tigers. So these are all defense mechanisms, or what I like to call coping mechanisms. And they're designed to actually protect you, but they also keep you in that state of fight or flight because you can't escape the emotional tigers, right? They are inside of you and they go with you everywhere you go. So no matter how fast you run, how busy you keep your mind, they're always there chasing you, right? So what are the emotional tigers? These are the traumas. These are the traumas that you were talking about. Now, trauma is a charged word, so I tend to not like to use that. What I'm saying is trauma is anything that just overwhelmed your nervous system. Okay. It just got overwhelmed and that was it. So it doesn't have to be something severe like a molest or a divorce, for instance. It could be anything like when I was a child, my dad had us watch Jaws, and that terrified me. That movie literally terrified me. So it was a trauma for me because it overwhelmed my nervous system, right? My nervous system couldn't handle it. And so it shut down. It didn't actually complete that stress response cycle. It shut itself down to try to protect me. And to this day, I'm afraid to go into the ocean because of Jaws. So the traumas that we speak of are highly individualized. Okay. And there's a whole range of what the traumas can be. And we'll get more into that in just a minute.
Can I stop
So,
you for 1 second? And I
sure.
don't want you to lose track, but I think this is something extremely valuable for people to like really understand because I was probably 5, and this is going to sound silly, but I watched The Wizard of Oz and it scared me to death. Well, my parents didn't know that. We didn't talk about it, and I didn't think about talking about it because 5-year-olds don't. But honestly, for years after that, I was scared to death to sleep in my room by myself. And I would wake up in the middle of the night in panic and fear. And it might sound silly, but I feel like as parents, we need to be more conscious about what we are allowing our children to watch. And I mean, we guarded our children fairly well, but I wish I had this information then so I could have guarded them honestly even more, especially at that young age when we're bringing out these Disney movies and people are like, "Oh, these are just innocent and fun with the princess." There's a lot of fear in there, and it's something that we don't think about.
I'm so glad you brought that up because there is a lot of fear in media, right? In the information that we're bringing into ourselves and to our children. I mean, a lot of the Disney movies have death, right? Like the mom dies, or even Bambi. I remember being traumatized watching Bambi because the mother died. Like, I mean, these are traumatizing events. And there's a difference between being exposed to something that builds resilience, right? Resiliency versus being exposed to something that now creates a lasting mark of trauma until you're able to process that. So it would be, I find it very helpful as a parent to be able to distinguish between the two. We want to create resilient children, but we don't want to be traumatizing them in the process, right? And I remember my child was actually afraid of the dark, and my children still are afraid of the dark, and I'm not a huge fan of the dark either, so I can relate, right?
Same.
But they were afraid of the dark. And I remember I didn't learn all of this until my healing journey. So I already had my 2 boys at this time. And with both boys, we did the norm that, you have the baby go sleep in the other room and you come to the baby when they cry, but right, everyone has their own bedroom. And so we did that. And it wasn't until years later, maybe my son was around 4 or 5, when we realized that he was afraid of the dark, like he was able to articulate it to us. And so we actually changed and we started to sleep tribally. So like the tribes used to do, like our ancient ancestors didn't. So, and I do want to say that oftentimes when I refer back to the ancient ancestors, people will say, oh, well, that's so outdated. That was so long ago. Like we've learned so much. We've advanced so much from that time. But get this, if you actually subtract out deaths from our hunter-gatherer ancestors, right? If you subtract out the deaths they experienced from giving birth and from when they were really young children, right? Subtract that out. Look at the lifespan of everybody else who was remaining. They lived just as long as we live today, but they had better quality of life than we do today. They didn't have years of chronic or autoimmune diseases. A lot of them lived healthy, like hunting, foraging, whatnot, all the way up to the end. And they often would die peacefully in their sleep, right? So they were doing something better than what we are doing today. So in my healing journey, one thing I've learned is true back to our roots, right? Every time I've trued back to my roots of the ancient ancestors, the answer has been very obvious. So in this case, they didn't have separate bedrooms for all their different children, right? They slept as a tribe. And part of that was to protect themselves from predators. But in that, there is that sense of safety amongst the tribe, right? You do feel protected. And so what we ended up doing with our kids is we started sleeping as a tribe, and we created little caves for them to sleep in, right? Kids will often feel safer if they feel like they're surrounded by support, and a cave will often provide that support. So we'd build it like little forts, right? Fort blankets, and we'd sleep in there together, and it's made all the difference in the world, right? In helping them calm down into the parasympathetic state. It's helped to rewire their nervous system, which is really where we're going with this, is rewiring the nervous system. So just like you said, when you're in this chronic state of fight or flight, and it starts from being a child, this can actually lead to the development of disease, anxiety, sleep issues, fatigue, dysbiosis of the microbiome. I mean, how many people do you know nowadays that are trying to combat leaky gut, right? It can stem solely from stress, which is another way of saying solely from being in a chronic state of fight or flight. So one way, and let me just give you one quick example, is that in fight or flight, cortisol, as I mentioned, is released, right? And that gives you a boost of energy to fight or to flee. But if you have elevated levels of cortisol, it leads to chronic inflammation, which can lead to insulin resistance, heart disease, allergies, or other inflammatory conditions. It also makes it harder to lose weight, and it makes it harder to feel joy or to feel even calm, right? It lowers your energy level. So what we know now is that fight or flight is, because this is how I like to think about it. I like to kind of ask myself questions to figure out logically, why is this happening? Because then the answer becomes very apparent of what you need to do. So the next question is, okay, we're in fight or flight roughly 70% of the day. So what is fight or flight? It's just a fear response. Okay. So if you think about that, that means that about 70% of every day, most of us are in a state of fear, right? I mean, you just know, your body just knows. As I say that to you, I'm sure your body is feeling like, whoa, that's not healthy, right? This is an obvious like awakening that is not healthy for me to be in fear 70% of the day. And so why am I in fear? Largely because I'm running from these emotional tigers. So where do these tigers come from? They largely stem from childhood trauma or from the nervous system being overwhelmed when you were a child. Okay. The most common belief that I hear, this is a limiting belief, is I'm not good enough. Right? When people say or believe that they're not good enough, it means they're not worthy of love. So what they're really saying is, I don't feel loved. And if you don't feel loved as a child, it means you don't feel safe. Okay. And so if a child doesn't feel safe, it means they don't view the world as a safe space to be in. So that means they're constantly in fear. They're constantly on guard. You're constantly looking for that next tiger. This is one reason why we have so many food sensitivities in our culture now, because the body is in this constant state of what's next, what's coming next, what's next. right? It's in this contracted state. Part of the reason why we have such a difficult time absorbing nutrients from our food, obviously from the leaky gut, but when you are in fear, the body is energetically contracted, right? You're not in this expansive state where you're like, so think of them, they're polar opposites. Fear, you're contracted, the body's shutting down because it's going into um, conservation mode. It's going into the protective mode. This is our evolutionary adaptation for survival. So now you're in survival mode. So you're not thinking of things like, oh, I need to digest my food better. Oh, I need to absorb all those nutrients and now start repairing my body. Your body's not thinking of that because it's solely trying to survive from what it perceives as being a constant threat in the environment. The flip side of that is if you're in the parasympathetic state, the body is expanding. It's an expansive state. This is where you would have more feeling of joy, of gratitude, of peace, and of love. This is a receiving state for the body. It is ready to receive the nutrients from the foods that you're eating. Your detox pathways, for instance, have now opened up, and they are functioning more efficiently. So now you're more able to better detoxify your body from any potential toxins that you may come into encounter with, right? The opposite of that, of course, the fear detox pathways have now downregulated. So when you are exposed to toxins, it affects you more because you have a decreased ability to get rid of those toxins. Okay, makes sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's the childhood traumas that prime you to be in that chronic state of fight or flight. There's two types of childhood traumas that I really like to focus on. One is called adverse childhood experiences. These are known as ACEs. And the other one is attachment traumas. So the ACEs, these are unresolved childhood traumas that could be physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual. Some examples are going to be your parents separated or they got divorced. You experience physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. You were physically or emotionally neglected. There was a mental illness in the family. Somebody somewhere in your family had substance abuse, or you saw somebody from afar that had substance abuse. Somebody that you knew went to jail. Your family had financial difficulties, or maybe you had a friend and their family was suffering from financial difficulties or a divorce and it affected you. Maybe you or one of your siblings or somebody in your family had an illness that required hospitalization. Or like me, my children witnessed me almost die from an autoimmune disease, right? Maybe you were bullied in school, right? Maybe they called you dumb or fat or slow or said you weren't creative or maybe like me, you watched Jaws, or like you, Wizard of Oz, right? Any of these things and more. This is a very short list. Any of these can actually overwhelm your nervous system and result in you not completing that stress response cycle. Okay. Now, ACEs, in my opinion, ACEs are one of the most overlooked risk factors for all chronic and autoimmune diseases, for anxiety, hormone disruption, sleeping issues, fatigue, and every other imbalance that you can think of. ACEs are the most overlooked risk factor. There's actually studies now that have concluded that ACEs are actually associated with an increased risk for chronic and autoimmune disease, especially among women. So the studies are showing that the more ACEs you have, the higher your risk for disease. So I'll cite just a couple studies for you to really drive this home. In the mid-1990s, the CDC and Kaiser, they analyzed 17,500 adults, right? That's a very large sample size, 17,500 adults. The scientists concluded that a high level of ACEs correlated with increased risk of developing 7 out of the top causes of death. So they're saying 7 out of the top causes of all deaths in America are related to ACEs. They said if someone has 4 or more ACEs, which is actually 4 is not actually hard to obtain, right? So let's say for me, my parents got divorced. My parents had financial difficulty. I saw Jaws, right? I was bullied in school. I was sexually molested by my stepfather. Oh, we're already at 5. Like, so 4 is really not that hard to achieve. So what this study showed, though, was that if you had just 4 or more ACEs, you had 4.5 times higher risk of depression, a 2.5 times higher risk of cancer, 2.6 times higher risk of stroke, and a 12-time higher risk of suicide. Right. A second study conducted in 2009, this one involved 15,300 adults. They said that if you had just 2 or more ACEs, just 2, you were 100% more likely to develop a rheumatic disease. So like arthritis, like I had. You have a 70% increased chance of developing type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis, Hashimoto's, or psoriasis, or any Th1 dominant autoimmune condition. And you had an 80% increased risk of developing a Th2 dominant autoimmune condition, which would be like lupus or IBS, asthma, allergies, or chemical sensitivities. The studies showed that the correlation between these ACEs and developing an autoimmune disease in adulthood is as strongly linked as smoking is to cancer. Right. And we know the link between smoking and cancer is solid, right? So the research is literally saying that this relationship between these childhood traumas and disease in adulthood is solid, right? It is established. Okay. So, and the way it's doing that is how I mentioned before, you have this dysregulated nervous system, right? Where you're spending most of your time in either the fight or flight or the freeze response. Okay. So the second type of childhood trauma is called attachment trauma or attachment disorder. So this happens when the baby's in utero and usually up to the first 2 years of life. Okay. So babies are actually born without the ability to manage or regulate their nervous system, which means they can't regulate their emotional state. Okay. Because the two are tied together. So they can't properly activate the fight or flight mechanism, which means their defense mechanisms are limited. And so they have to co-regulate with the mother. That means the mom shares her nervous system with her baby. Okay. And that sharing is called attachment. So in essence, the mother's nervous system trains the baby's nervous system how to be and how to respond to stressors. It is the template upon which the baby's nervous system is built. So if the mom has a healthy, what we call a regulated nervous system, meaning she can go into sympathetic and come back down into parasympathetic smoothly, okay? That's a regulated nervous system. She can deal with the stress. She can cope. She can soothe herself, right? If she has that healthy regulated nervous system, a secure attachment forms with the baby. And the baby will then most likely develop a healthy regulated nervous system. But if the mother's nervous system is dysregulated, an insecure attachment usually forms. And then the baby's nervous system usually is also dysregulated. Okay, that's called attachment disorder or attachment trauma or insecure attachment. So I'll give you a couple examples of how this can actually develop in the baby. So one is if in utero, the mother is experiencing a lot of stress, like there's war or divorce or, the recent upheaval in, I don't want to say the word, I don't want you to get censored, but you all know what I'm talking about. These stressful situations, right? Well, the mother, if she's in stress, she's going to release cortisol, right? As we mentioned, this is one of the stress hormones that's released when you go into fight or flight. Over long periods of time, let's say she wasn't able to manage that stressful situation. She wasn't doing good stress management and she couldn't just, release that stress and let it go. She's holding on to the stress. Okay. That means she's going to have elevated level of cortisol for an extended period of time. And that means it's a neurotoxin, right? So when cortisol is elevated for an extended period of time, it becomes a neurotoxin. That wires a pattern of stress into the baby. And so the baby tends to go straight into an overwhelmed state because it can't regulate its own nervous system. So now the baby's nervous system has been wired to be in a heightened state of stress because what happened was, as the mom is releasing these stress hormones, and let's say, stress can cause your heart rate to become elevated, right? It could increase blood pressure. Well, the heart, the aorta actually originates from the heart and extends through the spine into the abdomen and it surrounds the uterus. That means the blood flow through that artery creates a continuous background sound for the baby. It's like a white noise for the baby, right? But the flow is actually reflecting the mother's heartbeat. If her heart rate and her blood pressure are elevated because she's stressed, then the baby's body is going to receive that as a stress signal, and it's going to wire its nervous system thinking, oh, the outside environment must be really stressful. We must prepare for all this stress, right? So the baby's body is doing what it thinks it needs to do in order to cope to the perceived fear that's happening outside. Okay. And those are all cues getting from the mother. Okay. Another example of how the baby might not have a secure attachment is maybe the mom went back to work before the baby could actually co-regulate, right? But maybe, and this is what happened in my case, maybe the mom didn't go back to work, right? Like me, I chose to stay home with my kids. So I was physically present, but maybe the mom was checked out. Maybe she was in freeze response. Maybe she was dissociated, right? So she's physically present, but she's not emotionally available. And that's actually what happened to me. After I had my child, I dissociated, right? The nervous system got overwhelmed from having the baby, which can be a traumatic experience for many of us. And so I dissociated from it. And so I was fully present, but I was pretty numb, like emotionally numb. I just wasn't available. And so my baby didn't properly co-regulate, and we ended up having attachment trauma. Okay. So when this happens, you can see some clues, right? So it's not a one for one, but you can look at some types of coping mechanisms that people have come up with to determine if they may have actually experienced this kind of attachment trauma or ACEs, right? The childhood trauma. So we develop coping mechanisms because if the nervous system didn't actually develop properly, it can't self-regulate well, meaning it needs external things to help it calm down. So it won't calm down into the parasympathetic by itself. And you'll often choose something subconscious to calm it down. And we call these coping mechanisms. So maybe the person binge eats to calm down. And this actually makes sense because you have your vagus nerve down here by, along your throat. And when you swallow the food, it stimulates the vagus nerve, which can actually stimulate the parasympathetic and try to get you out of the sympathetic state. Okay. So binge eating is one potential coping mechanism that's a sign that somebody might have a dysregulated nervous system. Another one could be anorexia. Actually, it's the opposite, right? Another one could be shopping, like you see shopaholics, right? Working too much. This is me. When I get stressed out, when my nervous system gets overstimulated, even now, I tend to go seclude myself in my office and I start working. And that calms down my nervous system. So I actually become a workaholic, which, so I didn't say these coping mechanisms were good, but what you do is it's awareness, right? It's bringing awareness to why you have the behaviors that you do. And this actually, for me, is really freeing as a mother and as just a human, because it helps to explain why sometimes we've tried to change habits that we don't like, and we've not been successful in changing them. And then we get into this whole failure cycle, which is a fear-based cycle of, oh, why couldn't I do it? Why can't I just change that behavior? I must not be mentally strong enough. What's wrong with me, right? We go down this mental spiral and beat ourselves up about it. But a lot of this is coming from attachment trauma and from ACEs, okay? So working too much, keeping yourself busy, as we mentioned, jumping from one project to the next, that is a type of a coping mechanism. The distraction from social media or distraction using social media is a coping mechanism. Maybe you're obsessed with cleaning. Maybe you nitpick at things. Someone who can rarely sit to rest, right? Because sitting in a space of calm is uncomfortable. So like I have a good friend who's like this. She can't sit down and watch a movie with me. She's got to be doing her nails or getting up and, putting the book away or something. She can't actually just sit, right? That's a coping mechanism. Children have a little different types of coping mechanism. They can tend to be, if a child's more irritable or sarcastic, we tend to just shame them for that, like, why are you doing that? Like, don't you know how that makes people feel? Which doesn't actually help, because this is actually an indication that they have some kind of childhood trauma to the nervous system. They might actually cope by, if you've ever seen a child hang upside down on the sofa, right? The blood rushes to their head. That helps calm the nervous system down. Maybe they'll jump up and down on a trampoline. My son does that. We got him a mini trampoline as we're rewiring his nervous system. We got him a mini trampoline. It sits in the living room, and he'll just go now and jump up and down on the trampoline, because the rhythmic motions help regulate the nervous system. So if you have a child who really needs the rhythm, like songs, listening to certain songs with a rhythm, clapping along, strumming to an instrument, the rhythm of walking to a certain cadence, right? All of these things are actually coping mechanisms that help calm the brain, help calm the nervous system down. And the body is so smart. The body remembers the coping mechanisms that have worked and the ones that don't. And so oftentimes, this is why you'll see, like, say, if I get stressed out, one of my coping mechanisms is to eat sugar. And so I would start eating the sugar without even really thinking about it. It was like I'd get stressed, bam, where's the sugar? And I want to go eat it. And I would start eating it. And even if I felt sick to my stomach, my body still wanted to keep eating it, because it's trying to actually calm down my nervous system. But here I am judging myself. Why can't I just stop? I mean, my goodness, I'm sick to my stomach. I can't even stop, right? So that component of shame really gets drawn into our lives a lot. And that actually hinders your ability to heal, because it brings your body into the collapsed state, right? Instead of being into the expansive state. So let me just quickly connect the dots, because I just gave you a lot of information. Okay. So the take home point is this: that your early life experiences, whether it's ACEs and or attachment trauma, they put you in survival mode at a very young age. That means the traumas rewire your nervous system to be dysregulated, but they also set your immune system, your hormonal system, and your entire physiology. They affect which genes are going to be expressed, the neurotransmitters that are going to be expressed, and what level. They change your brain structure. They affect your epigenetics. They change your microbiome, basically set your whole homeostasis. By wiring you to be in a chronic state of fight or flight, it sets you up for disease later in life, or what I call imbalance. So you lose your resiliency. You become more susceptible to toxins in your environment. This could be physical toxins like the glyphosate, heavy metals, mycotoxins. It could be toxins, toxic people, toxic events. It also sets you up to be more likely to be sensitive to foods. So you'll develop more food sensitivities and allergies. In essence, you're in a reactive state, reacting to your environment, driven by fear. So you try to control, predict, and manipulate things because of the fear of the unknown, because you're perceiving that there's tigers always chasing you. And this creates the template for how you then will respond to future traumas and future stress as an adult.
I want to thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this very important information. And Sina, I want to thank you so much for spending this time sharing. We are going to have a part 2 with the solutions on how to help shut down some of these traumas, whether it's ACEs or the attachments. So there is a positive side to this, and that you can heal your body. I'm going to also link all of her information below. And I also want to remind you guys, if you're interested in my 3-day detox, you can get it for free. And I will also put that link below as well. So thanks again for watching, and you guys have a great day.